Okay, we're going to be headed for a quick networking break. Don't take too long. 10 minutes. Guys, promise me you're not going to take too long, okay? 10 minutes, and we're going to be right back, 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to be back with an interview with, if you guys are fans of the UFC, fans of the NFL, we have one of the greatest coaches of the UFC right here. So you guys can learn a lot by someone who coaches people to get punched in the face for a living. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's settle down. Thank you very much for coming back from the coffee break somewhat on time, not bad. Okay, let's all get settled down. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming back from the coffee break. Okay, so next up we have a very interesting interview titled The Transformative Power of Making Fear Your Friend. Ladies and gentlemen, our next guest has trained several NFL and UFC superstars. He also trained very famous politicians like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. Ladies and gentlemen, he's a 7-time world championship attending coach in combat sports, a former Division I linebacker at Fresno State, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, an author, and a philanthropist. He's also the founder of Empower. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mr. Tareq Azim. And for an athlete, he has a very relaxed walk. Mr. Tareq, let's go. Go ahead, sir. You can go ahead and the mic. Okay, so we're gonna set things up a little bit. So Mr. Tareq's training system, I don't know if I can call it that, or it's much more than that, has been also in high demand in Silicon Valley and in leadership training. So where did Empower, where did the idea for Empower come from? How did it all start?
Yeah, if you guys don't mind, is it on there?
Let's flip the switch up. Yep.
Better?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for having me today. A little bit of background on my perspective and how it all formed. My family and I are originally from Afghanistan and came to the United States as refugees in 1985. And I've kind of grown up with this perspective and this ideology around human optimization and having a must to belong. And I knew, given my circumstances, I probably wouldn't have much of a platform, being a guy with a lot of ideas. And so I always wanted to use sport to become relevant and physical activity to prove I belong. And as sport and physical activity was kind of giving me opportunities very young, I decided to kind of push the boundaries a bit on it the older I got. And I had some goals of wanting to be the first Afghan American to do things Afghans weren't doing in the United States. And very young, it started with just sports. And football was one of the first. There wasn't any Afghan football players who played Division I football, ended up getting a full ride scholarship to Fresno State as a linebacker. And as football kind of took off, I wanted to keep pushing the game a bit. And growing up, I did a lot of martial arts. And at that time, the sport of mixed martial arts and the UFC started to come to life. And there was local casinos not far from my four-year institution that were hosting fights for $50 a fight in buffets to the hotel kitchen. And just playing games like this, I just really started to see oh my God, this thing is giving me an opportunity and some platform. And it's when I started to make that shift of realizing look, I don't intend to be a sportsman to just be a sportsman for the rest of my life. I want to use sports to actually create a platform because it was getting me attention. And understanding and realizing that attention was the thing I was seeking, The question then was, well, what are you giving to that platform when you do get attention? And again, I didn't want to just be an athlete. I didn't want to be this guy who can run fast, or this guy who can submit, or this guy who can run the ball. I wanted to give more. And I made this realization of what I was starting to develop, and what I was actually developing was something I felt I never really had, which was a confidence. And a lot of my confidence was blocked by this insecurity of believing I was capable. And when I felt I was capable, I realized that I actually conquered something. And it was a relationship with the disease of fear. And I really started to dive into this thing very young, but I really couldn't articulate and speak on fear at that capacity. But it was this addiction I started to get with the more situations I can put myself in that causes this fear and causes this anxiety and causes these nerves is something I started to build an addiction to. And I realized that the outcome of that was always something that made me feel very, very good about myself. And it actually made me interesting. And that's all I was seeking. I just realized that there was fear that was preventing me from what I wanted to be and what I wanted to feel. And what I was seeking was acceptance. And it was only sport and physical activity that was actually giving me that. You know, I was doing very well in college, did great in academics, but so was everybody else, right? I was doing great with social impact, so was everybody else. But the one differentiator for me was sport. And in 2004, I had wrapped up my college career, and I wanted to be the first African American to play in the National Football League.
Wow.
And I wasn't far from that, and I had a really big issue pop up with my spine, and I ended up breaking my back. And when this back broke, I thought, like, how else am I going to have a voice for anything? And at that point, a big family situation kind of came to life in that period of time, and my family ended up going to Afghanistan. My father and mother.
Back to Afghanistan.
Back to Afghanistan for the first time in years. And I actually went to Afghanistan the day after I graduated from college, thinking I was going to go solve for this family land thing. And as you know, circumstances and situations always happen in their own way. And to me, I would say that visit was actually the calling of my life's mission I could never articulate. My life's mission was to be the guy that reconciles peace through the power of sport and physical activity. And when I got to Afghanistan, I said to myself, like, if I have something that I want to share with the world and have this platform, then I need to do something that normal people would never do. And at that time, I was battling with the Western media's narrative of the world. And the Western media was actually exposing the opposite of what was really going on in Afghanistan. And what was going on in Afghanistan was that Afghanistan was in a position and in a state that was ready for social change. But no nonprofit organization or government entity or any of these folks were kind of pushing that. So I said, what can I do would be the most disruptive thing to prove that Afghanistan's ready for social change and not make it political, and do something that politicians would never catch on to, or the government. And that's when I decided to create the Afghan Women's Boxing Federation.
Women's Boxing Federation.
Yep.
Afghan Women's Boxing Federation.
And it was actually the first in the history of any Islamic republic.
In 2004, during the
2007.
2007.
Yeah, so I was supposed to be in Afghanistan for about a month and a half, and ended up staying for almost 5 years.
Wow.
I got addicted to feeling valuable. My ideas were respected there. So yeah, long story short, that's kind of what I did. And when I did that, I targeted women to prove that the oppression campaign, yes, it did have legitimacy, but it only had legitimacy because nobody was doing anything about it. So the oppression consistently existed because no one was competing with oppression. We weren't creating alternatives. So I said, why don't I just do that to soften the oppression a bit? And when I wanted to announce doing that, a lot of the public wasn't very happy. And it was interesting because it wasn't the Afghan public, it was the expat public, which exposed to me like, oh my God, people really don't think peace is profitable. They need to keep disruption and this inactivity and this manipulation of fear active in order to stay in business. And I was disrupting that by showing the opposite, right? And one of the first things I had to do was to find endorsement for women to box in Afghanistan. And part of that endorsement was to convince the Taliban that they should support this. And everything I'm sharing with you is documented, by the way, so you can see it all. And this is when I went and found some of the most high-profile members of that regime during that period. And I presented to them, and I did something I don't believe a lot of people do when they want to solve issues, is communicate and respect kind of systems and cultures. And when I made that announcement and created a plan, one of the biggest endorsements I got were the Taliban, who said, if this is what you need to do, have them do it according to our laws. And if anyone gets in your way, we'll be your front line of security. And asked them if they would say that on camera. And they actually presented it on camera, that they would support this initiative. And when I knew I could solve for proving that Afghanistan was ready for social change by imposing the most male-dominated known to mankind in one of the most male-dominated societies, I knew I could solve for anything when it came to human optimization and desire. So if it wasn't for the women in Afghanistan, none of this would have ever happened for me.
So how far did you get with the Boxing Federation?
Well, it turned into an Olympic program. We ended up building 27 clubs throughout the country. And that's all I wanted to do, was just develop an infrastructure to prove new culture could be installed by being able to share philosophies, align philosophies, expose values, match values, just basic human principles and organizational structures that I believe every winning team and any winning organization or any winning firm should have. And I treated Afghanistan like a business. And that program went into an Olympic program, and it's pretty active up until the current establishment's situation. So I handed it over. Obviously, I didn't want anything to have a seat. I wasn't doing it for any of that. I did it to kind of create opportunities for some of these elders to be able to lead these initiatives. So it went all the way.
Wow. And then you go back to the States. You start working with pro athletes. Completely different problem from Afghani women to pro athletes, two different ends of the spectrum. If you can elaborate on that experience and how different was it?
It's interesting you say different, because it wasn't. It was actually the exact same.
Wow.
And since then, I built 5,600 case studies that was published in my book, proving that the entire world actually suffers from the exact same thing. And these athletes were no different than the girls in Afghanistan or the people of Afghanistan. And it was fear. And then it was getting down to diving into, like, how do you define fear? In every single case study I've done, it always leads from, like, the fear of being judged, the fear of not being accepted, the fear of X, Y, and I just keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and it always gets to the unknown, the fear of the unknown. And then my question at that point is like, well, what is the ultimate unknown? And what do you think everybody says?
Death.
Thank you. And when folks say death, then I know I have my opportunity, because my whole philosophy is based on the consciousness of death. Because death isn't an unknown, actually. It's the only reality. And for some reason, it's the last thing we prepare for, where my proposal is that's all we should be preparing for. And the question is, well, what do you take to your grave that you should be preparing for? I mean, you don't take your watch, you don't take your shoes, you don't take anything. And I'm like, no, you actually take everything, but you take everything in the form of a feeling. So if you think about it, your last breath on this planet is an accumulation of your life's feelings in one breath. And my proposal is about, how do you die content? And what do you have to do to die content? And there's obviously a list of things, right? There's always this forgiveness thing. There's about cleaning our hearts. There's about apologizing. There's about loving. There's about accepting. There's about taking risks. And there's the same issue that was going on in the National Football League. And when I got back to the States, I had built a really big brand in the U.S. because I was a college football player standout. I'd competed in the sport of mixed martial arts through college. And then I won an award with ESPN called the ESPYs in 2006, and that kind of put me on the map in the U.S. So when I returned in 2009, Tom Cable, the head coach of the Oakland Raiders, was like, hey, I've been keeping an eye on your work, and I watched you in college. Could you come do for our locker room what you did in Afghanistan? And that's how I got introduced to the National Football League, and I got my first gig as the head of player development with the Oakland Raiders in 2009.
Wow. And you've been, of course, credited with turning around so many careers in both the NFL and the UFC. So if you can take us through one of these case studies, how, like, usually you receive them, and how do you take them through the program, then at the end, the results?
Yeah, of course. My program all starts with something called a game plan. And I branded it as a game plan because I just love branding things. But in reality, it's if I don't brand it, you know what it's called? It's called an honest conversation. Because if I call it an honest conversation, no one will come to my office. So I call it a game plan, and everybody comes in there with these expectations that I'm going to form this like physical development program, this nutritional program, this mobility stuff. But it's primarily me jumping into key mental and emotional deficiencies that are preventing him from dying content. And 100% of the time it becomes a very, very, very emotional conversation. And it's only emotional because it means something to them, but it's also emotional because it's so foreign that we don't have that moment of truth with ourselves. Because it's very easy in professional sports, and obviously in Wall Street and Silicon Valley. We have the luxuries of having so many optics that cover up so much of our insecurities, and we actually use that as an excuse on why we don't impose more vulnerability, right? Titles, positions, associations with people, things, and so on. There's nothing wrong with any of it at all. But don't use that on why you don't deal with you. And that's what I go target with these athletes. Don't use your fame, don't use the big contracts, don't use the Lamborghinis, don't use all of this stuff to where you don't have to deal with yourself, because no one will challenge you because of what you have. And it's kind of getting to that truth is what the game plans start with. And then that kind of goes through an onboarding process of me asking what they want me to hold them accountable to. And that accountability is what our relationship is built on. And then I actually use all of the physical activities that we would coach. They're all based around body weight mechanics. And why I use body weight is because I could break you with just your body weight. And that's very humbling. And that lowers the waterline quite a bit. But then the good thing about that is that you can leverage the correlations of what you do physically and your key mental and emotional deficiencies very easily. But physical activity's never been used as a prescription to hone in on addiction and depression and anxiety and suicidal tendencies. Remember, there's a lot that goes into those outcomes, and the majority of that could be solved for with just narrative internally and correlations of physical activity. So why I was blessed to actually do that with these athletes was I just had the opportunity to have an honest conversation with them. And that honest conversation turned into everything.
Wow. That's incredible. And after the honest conversation, you take them through the physical training, and then they actually go through. So, okay, I'm going to ask you this question, and it's, so how often do they relapse? And then when they do relapse, because that's usually the hardest thing to come back from, because you've climbed this hill and then you've fallen back, how do you get them back up?
Well, I think that's kind of for everybody in here, right? Everyone in here is here because they're leaders of what they do, right? There's always individuals that are coming to us or to you for answers, for direction, for freedom, for opportunities. But we also can't forget that our expectations have to be modified based on the capacity of the individual we're coaching, we're teaching, or mentoring, right? And we have to know that there has to be, we have to be okay with, there has to be bumps and hiccups that come along the way in order for them and you to be able to form character together.
Wow.
Right? If it just goes from like whatever I say or whatever you say to them and it's like boom, straight, great, what did they develop from that? Other than achieving something you set them up to do, right? Versus being honest with them, honing in on their deficiencies, exposing their capabilities, know that they don't know, and it's okay to not know. But I always have expectations. I mean, look, Deion Jordan, for those of you who know of football or not, but he was one of the most decorated football players that came out of the 2013 draft. He was the number 3 overall pick by Miami Dolphins, just a freak specimen. And after not even a full season, he got suspended from the National Football League for drug and alcohol addiction. And the thing was, he was always addicted to drugs and alcohol, but people prior to the NFL never chose to look at it or to see it or deal with it. As long as he performed, it's okay. And it caught up to him in the National Football League, and he had a really bad suicidal episode where he was done with the league. And he was the first person in the history of the National Football League to come back. It took us 18 months, but he came back, and he had a couple of those episodes where he relapsed. But as part of my expectations were, I want him to relapse. I want him to relapse because I want to see how much he values what he's doing. Because after his relapse, he would come back. And I made vulnerability safe for him. So he came back and said, hey, I didn't come in because I drank and I fell off the boat, but I want to fix that. And he expected me to tear him apart I actually gave him a hug and I told him I was proud of him for actually loving and respecting something now.
Wow.
And I think that that's the freedom we have as individuals in your positions, who you sit in a position where people are looking to you for solutions and answers. And I think that the titles and the positions and the chairs you all sit in, they're a lot more than just a job opportunity or developing of cash flow. You guys are individuals that are sitting in a position of true leadership and true impact. And I think that when you have that type of megaphone and that type of microphone and that type of pedestal, it's endless of how much you can do for people. And that's kind of what I was really big on leveraging my platform for. Like I said from the get-go, as I alluded to earlier, it wasn't necessarily about a championship. It's not about a Super Bowl. It's not about an ESPY. It's not any of this stuff. Like I just don't feel I'm even close to what I want to do yet, because it's just about serving people to capitalize on platforms.
So from serving the girls in Afghanistan, serving pro athletes, and now you have a major role in Silicon Valley. So how does that philosophy translate there?
Well, it comes down to goals and ideals for not normal people, right? Like my hashtag for everything in my business and interviews has always been about attracting the not normal community. The individuals that don't have the normal people goals and dreams, but they know there's not normal activities and behaviors and truths that have to be integrated into your life and into your system, are the ones that kind of get attracted to me. And I think when folks had seen my work with some of the athletes and some of the folks in entertainment and some of these other professionals, then a lot of different organizations, large private equity firms like KKR and TPG and Thoma Bravo and Genstar and all these monsters out there, it was their leadership and their CEOs that actually came to me, not the companies. I wouldn't work with the companies. I work with the CEOs and the founders first for a year. And then what happens is that they say, hey, is there any way you can help me develop this? I want everyone in my company to feel like I do. And then that's when I take my system and I start to integrate that into the cultural identity of their organizations. Wow. So they're no different than the women in Afghanistan.
Wow. And, okay, I want to open the floor for questions. Can we use the last 5 minutes for questions? Do we have any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, I got one right here.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your amazing message. I feel very inspired, so thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you, you said that football empowered you, but you broke your back. So when you broke your back, if that had happened to me, I would be like, I'm lost, I'm done, I won't be able to put it back together again. And I would be like, perhaps in a suicidal, depressive mode.
Of course.
So, how do you dealt with that?
The thing is that never stops. Because for some reason, our Creator always puts me in that position. And if it's, I've had 4 operations on my spine now, because I just don't stop. And I don't think that's smart either, right? I'm not going to say, it's resiliency. It's stupidity on my end, but with the initial situation, it just derailed an ideal I had about going into the National Football League. Because our Creator knew my intention of being in the league was getting to this point today. But one way or another, without playing in the National Football League for a 10-year career, I'm exactly where I wanted to be. And where my head went at that point was, so much of my life, I didn't grow up like I should have, right? With who my family is and what type of lifestyle we all had in Afghanistan prior to all of this, and overnight refugees and develop and obviously I was born in Germany at a refugee camp, a refugee hotel, and wasn't a camp. And coming to America and being raised on government support and Section 8 and living in the projects my whole life, it was very easy for me to play victim growing up. But for some reason, subconsciously, I just never played victim. And I had fantastic parents is why. They always reminded us who we were and where we came from. Always. I always felt like the general's grandson, even though I was living in the projects in San Francisco. But when that happened to my back and I had an opportunity to play victim, all of those subconscious behaviors and practice of resiliency kicked in, where it was just kind of, It's his plan. And that's what I've kind of fully surrendered to. I think anytime I feel any sort of adversity that's outside of my control, I just truly believe it's part of the plan. So much of my life has been that when something like this happens, I don't let it derail me. It'll take me a few minutes, obviously. It'll take me a couple of days. It'll take me some questioning, some tears, some emotional imbalance. It's okay. Like, I'll say some bad words, I'll do these things. But I get myself right out of it right away, like not forgetting, like, look, where you were, where your family was, where you are, like these things happen because it's building your character, it's building your story. You don't want it easy, it's been my mentality. I don't become interesting if it's easy. And I need that for my own confidence. So I look at adversity like I do at fear. It's an opportunity. I'm not going to use it like a lot of my counterparts do as an excuse on why I don't want to be responsible to my truth. Did that answer it? Did I answer? Yeah? Okay. Sorry.
Thank you very much for sharing your professional and personal story. That's, I think, super inspiring and impressive. It looks like and feels like you have a laser-sharp mind. What is your simple advice to the audience in terms of improving their daily schedule and just having the clarity and focus that you have?
Thank you so much. I'm so far from it, but I'm working on it myself. I think some of where I've gotten to with consistency with a lot of folks, which I would call my stable, is that focus really comes from intentionality. You know, I think that like laser on what is the question I think we have to ask ourselves, and that what from my direction is always intention, because that intention never stops. I think the intention needs to be a lot bigger than a task. I think the tasks need to contribute to the intention, and that intention is what the laser focus literally lives on until our last breath. I really do think we should have that type of emotional engagement with anything we're doing on a day-to-day basis, because look, at the end of the day, not one of us know when our last breath is, right? So I think this work thing and these projects and these associations and these networks, they're all part of it, right? And every single thing that happens in our lives contributes to that. But I just think it's very, very important that we identify the intention of why we're doing what we're doing. And I truly believe that that locks in the laser focus.
Thank you. Hi, Tareq. Thank you. Lovely to hear you speak. I'm going to share a small incident that happened that I got to know yesterday. So there was an entrepreneur that I knew for the past 3 years. I invested a bit of capital in his business. And on my way to Conrad Hotel, somebody called me and told me that he passed away. And he died in his apartment in City Walk. Now, when I heard this, I just had to cancel the meeting because I was in a state of shock and I was trying to find the guy because he owed me some money. So I understand the problem the athletes go into. The NFL is full of stories, you quite rightly said. But I see this trend following into the tech entrepreneurs these days. How would you relate this from athletic background going into the entrepreneurs? And we've seen this over the years with the students that they go through in this sort of trauma. So what would you advise for entrepreneurs who go through failures after failures, and it's only a few percentage who probably come out of it, and some of them just drown over the period?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I'm sorry about your loss. Look, I think one of the important things for anyone leading these young entrepreneurs is realizing that failing doesn't really exist. I think we need to educate and recalibrate and redefine language. Language comes with a lot of emotion, and generationally, the evolution of language has changed tremendously. Like what meant failing during my grandfather's time, it's not failing anymore, right? So I think I think we should update that software too, of language, especially with this generation. It's a lot different. These young entrepreneurs are a lot different than our generation and the generation before us. So I think one is being okay redefining that failing really doesn't exist. I think failing actually exposes opportunity, right? Failing actually exposes vulnerabilities. It exposes a lot, right? So I think that folks and young entrepreneurs should actually be fiending and seeking failure versus, hey, try to avoid it, because then they're actually building their entire entity on fear, right? Versus embracing the fear of being like, look, I'm going to risk it all. I'm going to go all in. I'm going to be okay with whatever comes my way. But guess what? The worst thing that could ever happen to me isn't going to happen to me. Because I bet you nobody in this room could answer if I asked that question. What's the worst thing that can ever happen to us? What'd you say? So as I mentioned earlier, death is actually the... Right, but again, you have to remember, I think a lot of us in here have a sense of a relationship with our faith. And death is a guarantee, and it's something scripted. And if you think about it, death isn't a bad thing, because it actually only happens when it saves us from pain. So if death isn't the worst thing that can happen, or a bad thing that can happen, what is the worst thing that can happen to us? And I think that's what these young entrepreneurs need to understand. Failing is important. And failing should be applauded. Failing is where you're actually going to earn your stripe on your belt. And I think when we're investing in these young folks, we should kind of make that a part of our protocol and our onboarding, right? And make that part of our value systems, to where these individuals don't ever feel like there is there is no failure. I'm being set up to succeed.
Next question.
All right, so it's really a comment. Thank you for everything you've said. You mentioned boxing. I had the honor of meeting Muhammad Ali when he came to Saudi Arabia. He came for a pilgrimage. I was probably 10 years old. And I was so fascinated by the power of sports to really rule the world and have that impact. So I do relate in that sense. You talked about your injury. I also relate, because when I had a torn meniscus, but I was called to climb Everest Base Camp to promote physical activity in 2012. And it was mind over matter, and I climbed with a torn meniscus. I loved what you said about identity. I think a man without a past is a man without a future. And that is so true, 100%. I think that was very empowering. You talked about death. And I just want to say a real quick story. My daughter, she was probably 7, had like food poisoning. And I was at the neighbors who had an exhibition. And she called me and she's like, Mom, I think I'm dying. So what do I say? I say, it's okay. You're going to see the angels. And I don't know, that's the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, okay, that's not the worst thing that's going to happen. And somebody overheard me and thought that this cool mother is telling her daughter it's okay to die. She's going to go see the angels. It was an instinct, I guess. But I think I really want to say last, your game plan, I really see you as the next Muhammad Ali in terms of impact. So good luck with that.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Far from.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Coach T is going to be having an open discussion with everyone. So if you guys want to ask more questions, you guys want to hang out with him, he's very friendly. I think you're friendly, right?
Just a little jet lag, but then I'm good.
Okay. At around 4:45. So for now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Coach T.
Thank you. Thank you.